We're in the second week of our 6-week journey leading up to Easter. This year we're calling our journey The Art of Neighboring, based on the book by that name. Last week we talked about the value of taking the Great Commandment seriously. The Great Commandment is found in Luke 10:27. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. The first part about loving God with everything we have, we all get that. We all understand that. We all want to do that, right? But the second part of the Great Commandment has largely been ignored by Christians, because when we hear that commandment to love our neighbor, we kind of generalize it to say, well, I just need to be a more loving person. I need to be loving to everybody around me. And while that is true, what happens is that when we try to make everybody our neighbor, often we make nobody our neighbor, and we don't actually take responsibility for loving anyone in our neighborhood. We saw last week that city leaders around our nation don't see any difference between the way the Christians and non-Christians treat their actual neighbors, which means that Christians on the whole are doing a pretty miserable job of doing the Great Commandment that Jesus told us to do. And so instead of trying to apply this command to love our neighbor to everybody in the world all at once, maybe we should kind of go back to basics and try to love our actual neighbors who live 50 or 100 feet away from us. And last week, you saw the tool that we call a block map. If you went to your small group, you have one. It looks like this. It's on the screen behind me as well. And the first step on the block map is to fill in the names of the 8 closest neighbors who live around you. And so let me ask you, how many of you last week you took your block map, put it on the refrigerator or somewhere you'd see it, and you actually managed somehow to fill in at least one name on that block map? Anybody? All right. Way to go. You're doing the Great Commandment. And if you didn't do that, I want to encourage you to get started, because I'm going to come up again here next week and I'm going to try and make you feel guilty if you haven't started on that yet, right? We also talked last week about how your neighbors are one of 3 things. They're either a stranger, an acquaintance, or somebody you have a relationship with. And so the goal of this journey is to kind of move us down the line with our neighbors so that we go from stranger to acquaintance, or from acquaintance to having a relationship with our neighbor. Why? Because you can't love your neighbor unless you have some kind of relationship with them. Now, my guess is that some of you walked out of here last week somewhat conflicted. Because on the one hand, you hopefully started to realize, wait, this is not that difficult. It needs to start with just learning the names of the people around me. I can do that. I can start to get to know my neighbors. But if you're like me, you probably were also thinking to yourself, how in the world will I have time to do any of that? My life is so full. How am I going to have time for even one more relationship, much less 8? Anybody feel like that? And I believe this issue of time is probably the biggest obstacle that we have to overcome if we're going to get serious about doing the Great Commandment and loving our literal neighbors. And so today I want to talk about this question: do we live at a pace that allows us to be available to the people that live around us? Do I live at a pace that allows me to actually love my neighbor as myself? I used to be a long-distance runner. My longest race ever was when I was a senior in college. I ran not just a marathon, but it was basically 2 marathons back-to-back. It was a 50-mile race. And it took me 8 hours and 15 minutes. I finished 25th out of 400. And starting about the 15-mile mark, I ran with a friend of mine from college named Greg. He and I were very equal in running ability. And so we're running along, and at the 15-mile point, I started thinking, Greg is setting a really fast pace. About the 18-mile point, I'm thinking, wow, I'm getting really tired, and I got 32 miles to go. About the 20-mile point, I'm thinking, this is really wearing me down. This is really too fast. But, I didn't want to say anything to Greg, because then I sound like a wimp, right? Like I'm whining, you're going too fast. And about the 22-mile point, I'm thinking, I'm not going to be able to stay with him At the 23-mile point, I finally said something. I said, Greg, you're just going a little too fast, so hey, see you later. You keep going. I'm going to slow down. And then Greg told me, I was just trying to stay with you. I was thinking, you're going way too fast. I'm not going to be able to stay with you. And it turned out we had been doing a really bad job of pacing each other. We were going too fast, and if we had kept that up, we would have burned out and not been able to finish the race. That is a picture of life. All of us have a tendency to go faster or sometimes slower at times than we really should. Often we try to cram so much into certain, times in our life because we're trying to keep up with other people, or other times we waste huge amounts of time. We're just not very good pace setters. And to make matters worse, we live in a world that values production and results and activity, and we think that the more you produce, the more you're worth. And so you've got email overflowing your inbox, and you've got voicemail boxes that are overflowing, and if you're like me, you create these little lists that of all the things that you want to get done each day so that you know that you're accomplishing what you should be, and so we constantly are trying to keep up. And this despite the fact that we live in a time when there are more time-saving devices than at any other point in the history of the world. If somebody came up to you 25 years ago, which, by the way, is shortly before the smartphone was invented, and they said, guess what? Let me tell you what your life is going to be like in 25 years. You're going to be able to work while you're driving your car. You're going to be able to talk to your car, which is connected to your smartphone, and you'll be able to make phone calls while you're driving. And not only that, you could actually write emails or put things on your calendar just by talking to your car. Unbelievable stuff. Or, if we had said, you're going to have this thing on your TV so that you can just record anything you want and then watch it later without any commercials. It's going to save you a lot of time. And you know what? You won't even have to go to the store anymore. You can just order from Amazon on your smartphone. It'll be delivered in a couple days. And you could go on and on and on with all this list of things that 25 years ago we could never even imagine, all of which save us enormous amounts of time, right? And if I would have told you all that, possibly your first thought would have been, well, what am I going to do with all that extra time? I'm going to be able to do in 20 hours what used to take me 40 hours, and so I'm going to have the life I always wanted. I'll be able to spend 20 hours more every week playing golf or hanging around with my family or going to the gym or whatever else you want to do. I'm going to have plenty of time for all that. But what's the reality? Very few of us have actually used that technology to create more space or more margin in our lives. What most of us has done is we simply try to jam more and more into our days and do more and more, because if I don't do more, everybody else is doing more, and I'm going to fall behind. And now I have to admit, I'm not a very good example in this area that we're talking about today. For most of my life, I've been trying to jam too much into too little time, and I've lived many of my years on the edge of burnout, which is not a good thing. But I'm learning. I'm getting better. Kathy and I moved to this area because I got transferred here by General Electric, and we bought a new house that didn't have any trees. And so I wanted to plant some. And so I got a garden catalog, and I saw that there was this hybrid poplar tree that the garden catalog claimed was the fastest growing tree in the world. And that in no time at all, you would have shade for your house. And so I said, I like that. I like fast. I want fast. And so I bought 3 of those trees, planted one on each side of the house and one in the backyard. And let me tell you, that garden catalog was absolutely right. Those were the fastest growing things I have ever seen. Within 10 years, those trees were towering over my house. In 15 years, they were literally this big around. I could not put my arms around them. They were huge. But they're all dead now. I realized that trees that grow really fast don't live very long. And so I had to pay a lot of money to have some people take down these huge trees next to my house. And I learned something along the way. I started to realize that fast isn't always best. Have you figured that out? I wish I'd planted maple trees because they would have grown a lot slower, but they'd be around for another 100 years. And in fact, I think that's kind of a symbol for my life. I've rushed some things that maybe I shouldn't have rushed as much. And so after all three of those trees are dead, I did something that might seem kind of silly, but I went back to my garden catalog and I did a little research and I bought a white oak tree and planted it in my backyard. Because according to my research, a white oak is the longest living tree that will thrive in the Midwest area. In fact, the oldest tree in Ohio is a 390-year-old white oak. I put a picture of one that's on the left here. That's not the oldest. That's one in Butler County that's a mere 300 years old. And then on the right side next to it is my white oak tree. As of Friday, that's what it looked like. It's kind of scrawny looking, right? Even though it's 6 or 7 years old. But you know what? It's going to live a long time. In fact, I don't think I probably will be around to see if it lives 600 years. But I'm thinking, I'm planning to live forever with God. And so I think in a few hundred years, I'm going to ask God if I can come back and just check it out, see where it is. What's the point? Sometimes fastest is not best. Now, one of the reasons that we try to live at this warp speed, try to jam more and more and more into our lives, is that we believe several myths. The first myth is that someday things are going to settle down. We tell ourselves that, don't we? Someday, hey, if I could just get through this week, it's going to settle down, it'll be a little more peaceful, or this month or this year. But that never actually happens, does it? It never actually settles down and then just stays that way, does it? I was thinking about that this past week. Seems like whenever I have time to spare, I just jam something else into my life, and so my time is all filled up again. About 8 years ago, Kathy and I became empty nesters. The kids are all grown. We have more time on our hands. And that's wonderful, isn't it? When you finally can start to relax after years of chasing the kids around and going to 42 different sports and school events every week. And, finally I get to rest, right? Well, not so much. What actually happened is I started buying old houses and fixing them up. And so I spent all my days off and all my spare time renovating these old houses. And so I had even more on my plate than when I had kids at home. You see, there's always something more that you can find to take up your time and jam into your life if you want. And so here's the truth about this myth. Things are only going to settle down when we get intentional about saying no to some things. When we get intentional about saying no to some things. Or when we die. That's another possibility. But things will only settle down when we get intentional about saying no. The second myth is that someday more is going to be enough. There's this myth that we would never say this out loud or admit this to anybody else, but we kind of have it floating around the back of our head is that, if I just had a little bit more, I'd be content, right? And over time, that myth will drive you crazy and it'll kill your happiness because it is so not true. More can never make you content. And then the third myth is that everybody lives like this. Everybody lives at this hectic pace. Everybody kind of skims the surface of life and doesn't have time to go really deep. Everybody lives like that. And that may seem like it's true, but the truth is, everybody does not live like that. Everybody does not live with this sense that there's just too much to get done and not enough time to do it. In fact, Jesus tells us there's a different way to live. Turn to Luke chapter 10 of your Bible. If you were here last week, we were looking at Luke 10 last week as well. Thank you so much. Luke 10 is actually where we find the story of the Good Samaritan that we talked about last week, as well as the Great Commandment. And in fact, what we're reading today directly follows the Good Samaritan story. So Luke 10:38, as Jesus and his disciples were on their way, he came to a village where a woman named Martha opened her home to him. She had a sister called Mary, who sat at the Lord's feet listening to what he said. But Martha was distracted by all the preparations that had to be made. She came to him and asked, "Lord, don't you care that my sister has left me to do the work by myself? Tell her to come help me." "Martha, Martha," the Lord answered, "you are worried and upset about many things, but few things are needed, or indeed only one. Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken away from her." Now, let's see what we can learn from these two sisters. Let's start with Martha. At first glance, it looks like Martha is the one who really gets it, right? She cares so much about Jesus that she opens up her home to him and prepares a meal for him. Those are good things to do, right? But in the process, Martha has become distracted. She's rushing around. She's hurrying to get everything done. And as a result, she misses out on the main thing. She's got the Son of God sitting in her living room, and she's so busy trying to serve him that she doesn't take time to be with him. She missed the main thing. Last week on Valentine's Day, Kathy and I went to a Jim Brickman concert. It was a great concert. A couple minutes after we took our seats, Kathy poked me and she says, "Oh, look who's here." And in the next row, right in front of us, there was a guy who was a part of our church for many years named Brian. In fact, he managed our softball team for a few years. And so Brian and I spent a couple minutes, catching up on things before the concert started. I asked about his son because I knew his son had joined the Marines. He said, "Oh, yeah, he loves it. He's doing great." And he told me where he and his wife are stationed now. And then kind of as an afterthought, he added, "You remember that you did their wedding?" And I just smiled and nodded. But on the inside, I'm thinking, I did? I didn't even remember that I did their wedding. And, it's because over the years, I've done so many weddings, I can't even remember half the people that I've married. True confession. But it got me thinking about it this week as I was preparing this message, and I started thinking about weddings. And one of the things I've noticed about weddings is that oftentimes there is so much that has to get done leading up to a wedding. There's so many preparations. It's like crazy with all the stuff you got to do, and the families are running around, and the bride especially is running around checking off all the little boxes, worrying about all the details and hurrying to make everything just right. And it becomes so stressful that you don't even get to enjoy it. Here they sunk a ton of time and money into this beautiful wedding, and they don't even get to enjoy it. And then it's over before they even know it, and they say, "Wow, that went quick." And it's kind of sad when you think about it. Martha's story is like that. This may have been the only time that Jesus ever came to stay at her house, and she's rushing around so much she doesn't even get to enjoy it. That's a lesson for you and me. We are in so much danger of missing the point in our lives when we get hurried and when we worry. Because this doesn't just happen at weddings. This happens in our spiritual lives. John Ortberg wrote a great book titled "The Life You've Always Wanted." One of the most powerful things he says in this book is that hurry is the great enemy of spiritual life in our day. Hurry is the great enemy of spiritual life in our day. And he coined this phrase, hurry sickness. You may think that the flu has been bad this past winter. There is an epidemic of hurry sickness that is way worse. And he says the reason why hurrying is so dangerous is because love and hurry are not at all compatible. Because love always takes time. And time is the one thing that hurried people do not have. Let me say that again. Love and hurry are not at all compatible because love always takes time. And time is the one thing that hurried people do not have. In our relationships, whether it's with our spouses or coworkers or kids or friends or neighbors, or whoever, hurry is toxic. Hurry is a sickness. Now, here's the amazing thing about this story. We have to realize that what Martha doing was certainly not bad. I mean, she's inviting Jesus into her home. She's serving him. She's serving God. But she's being reprimanded for serving Jesus. Doesn't that seem kind of crazy? She's serving Jesus, and he tells her, no, you're doing the wrong thing. And here's the point that Jesus is making. Sometimes we need to say no to good things in order to center our lives on the main thing. Let's look at the other sister, Mary. See, in our culture today, a woman listening to teaching is the same as a man listening to teaching. It's fine. It's good. 2,000 years ago in the Middle East, it was different. In the Hebrew culture, for somebody to sit at the feet of a rabbi listening to their teaching indicated a relationship between a disciple and a teacher. And women back then weren't allowed to be disciples. Women back then didn't go to school. They weren't allowed to be students. In that culture, they were supposed to be in the kitchen helping their sister prepare the meal. A woman's worth in that day was tied to her gift of hospitality and her ability to be a good hostess. But Mary doesn't care if she's going against the cultural norms of her day. She doesn't care what anybody else thinks because her life is centered on the main thing. She realizes that knowing Jesus is the main thing, and then she acts on that realization. And Jesus told Martha that only one thing is needed. Mary figured out that one thing, and then she lives it out. And she's the one who's commended, not Martha, who's working so hard to serve God, but has missed the main point. And so the question becomes, how do we become more like Mary and less like Martha? Well, let's back up and look at the big picture. In Luke chapter 10, Jesus says two main things. We talked about the first one last week. He said the main thing is to love God and to love your neighbor, the great commandment. Then at the end of this chapter, Jesus says to Martha, you've missed the main point. Mary has chosen what is better. And Mary chose the better by forgetting the cultural norms, forgetting the expectations of others, and going after the main thing. In order for us to be like Mary, we may have to go against culture as well. In order to love our neighbors, as Jesus commanded us to do, we probably have to be more like Mary and forget about what other people are doing. And forget about what other people think is important. Forget about what they think we should do and choose the main thing that Jesus told us to do. And you see, unfortunately, in our society, we've come to live at a pace that makes really loving our neighbors almost impossible. And if we want to change that to obey Jesus, it's going to be countercultural. Even more so than Mary sitting at the feet of a rabbi. If we're going to love our neighbors well, we have to make time to be with them in our neighborhood. And for many of us, this means that we're going to have to say no to some good things that everybody around us just does without even thinking about it. And Dave Runyon calls this the art of elimination. Figuring out what needs to go from our lives so that we can follow Jesus. And he talks about going to Florence, Italy, seeing a statue of David. I put a picture of the statue on the next slide. It's often considered to be the greatest sculpture masterpiece that's ever been sculpted. There's a story about the statue. The Pope asked Michelangelo what was the key to his great artistry in taking this huge block of marble and creating a masterpiece. Michelangelo said, it's simple. I just remove everything that isn't a masterpiece. I just remove everything that isn't a masterpiece. I think that is Jesus' heart for how we should live our lives the way he wants us to live. We have all kinds of different options. We have all kinds of different choices that we can choose to be involved in. And many of us fill our plates so full and we are stretched so thin that we're worn out all the time. And I think we actually miss the main thing that God wants to do in our lives. That's why many of us need to learn how to remove the things that aren't a masterpiece. remove the things that God doesn't want us to be involved in. And those aren't necessarily bad things. They may be good things. Just like it wasn't a bad thing for Martha to be serving Jesus. Not at all. They're not bad things. They're not the main thing. You know, when you read about the life of Jesus, never, ever, not even one even time, do you ever find a single time when it says that he was in a hurry. You never find that. And yet nobody ever accomplished more in one lifetime than Jesus did. Because he knew how to focus on what really matters. There were times when Jesus intentionally left the crowds behind and went off to be by himself. So he was leaving one very good thing so that he could be involved in the best thing. And this is so critical. If I want to say, yes, Jesus, I will do your great commandment. I will love my neighbor. Then I'm going to have to say no to some good things in order to do that. A friend of mine had a vacation home, and though I don't have one, I know that vacation homes are good things. But he told me one day, you know, that vacation home is taking so much of my time. I think it's taken away from what God wants to do in me in this area. And so he got rid of his vacation home. I was telling you earlier how I used to spend all my spare time and days off buying old houses and renovating them. I got to a point where I said, you know what? Enough is enough. I need some margin in my life. I can't fill every second with work. I need to cut something out. And so 6 years ago, I stopped buying houses. I'm not going to do that anymore. And now I have time to do whatever God calls me to do. You see, when we say yes to everything that comes along, then of course we're not going to have time to really love our neighbors as Jesus tells us to. Of course not. You and I can't do everything. We're not supermen. We can't move at super speed. There's only so much we can do. So we have to make some hard decisions. And this goes back to what we talked about last week. Am I willing to take seriously Jesus' command to love my neighbor, even if I have to give up some things in order to do it? Now, I don't know what that means for your schedule. I'm just letting you know that maybe God is calling you to give up some things or to say no to some things in order to center your life on what matters most. The story of Mary shows us at times we have to live in a countercultural way in order to center our lives on the main thing. And Jesus asked Martha to say no to one good thing so she could say yes to the main thing. We're going to close in a minute, so I'd like the worship band to come up. But as you leave here today, I want to encourage you to slow down for just a moment, sometime today, and ask God to speak to you. Just slow down for a minute and ask God, what is your desire for me? What is on your heart for my family? What's the next step that you want me to take in order to love my neighbor? Maybe it's to simply go out of your way sometime this week to learn somebody's name that lives around you. Or maybe it's to have a meal with the person across the street. I don't know what it is for you. But just ask God, what are you calling me to do in order to love my neighbor? What is the next step? Let's stand for prayer. God, we ask you right now that you will give us a heart for our neighbors to the point where we make time in our lives where we can make them a priority. And would you start right now in our lives by showing us what is that next step that you want us to take? Would you use the people in this room powerfully to reach our neighbors and change lives for eternity? We pray this in Jesus' name.